Hello and welcome to this video. It's Grammar Tuesday. Everything you see in this video comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to Grammar, which you can pick up through following the links in the description. Today we're going to talk about figures of speech. We move beyond with language analysis and language use. We move beyond De Forest as a quite a basic sort of level of language use and language analysis. And we're going to look at other figures of speech today. So a figure of speech is a device that rises above its literal meaning. There are some easy ones that you'll all know, and then there are some quite tricky ones. I'm going to go through them, and I'm going to look at how they're used in examples from literature. So the first one is a simile. Now a simile compares one thing to another using the words like, as, or as. They help to create a particularly vivid description. To give you an example from the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, Holmes looked at him thoughtfully like a master chess player who meditates his crowning move. This is a very strong image, a very vivid description of how cunning and how wise this character of Sherlock Holmes is. You know, it's just, rather than just say he looked at him thoughtfully, which would be pretty basic. Along with simile comes metaphor. A metaphor states that something is something else when you know that's impossible to be that. And I think that's one of the bits some people struggle with metaphor. It's only a metaphor if you say something is something else when it couldn't actually be that thing. So an example in Middlemarch by George Eliot. What business has an old bachelor like that to marry, said Sir James. He has one foot in the grave. He means to draw it out again, I suppose. There's a metaphor about having one foot in the grave. He doesn't literally have one foot in the grave. It's a metaphor of being a bit old. You can also then use humour with similes and metaphors. Oscar Wilde had a great metaphor. True friends stab you in the front, meaning that a true friend doesn't do something behind your back. If they're going to attack you, they'll attack you openly to your face. Personification then is where you give human characteristics to something that's not human. It's very useful when we relate the actions of things to our emotions as humans. So it's a good way of understanding something. In Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death poem, she writes, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. There's some personification of death. Hyperbole is dramatic exaggeration used to emphasize or sometimes for humour. Hyperbole is the best thing. That's a bit of dramatic exaggeration. The example that I'll give you is from Andrew Marvell's poem to his coy mistress, which I do have a detailed video analysis of that poem on this channel. So this is a funny poem where basically the speaker in the poem is trying to persuade a woman to have sex with him, and he uses hyperbole to say what he would do if he had all of the time in the world. He'd spend 100 years, should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, an age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. This over-the-top exaggeration that he would just spend 100 years to praise her eyes. You know, it's just ridiculously over the top. Of course, there's also some of the numerical use there, statistics from De Forest, but Andrew Marvell's poem is just humorous all the way through, kind of very, very enjoyable poem. Now a pun, some people mistake this for just any kind of joke, but a pun plays on the idea that words sound the same but have different meanings. So I go into more detail on that with adverb jokes in the ebook. But in Romeo and Juliet, you've probably all seen it, the dying Mercutio uses a pun to crack a joke when he says, tomorrow you shall find me a grave man. Grave meaning serious, and grave meaning as in I'll be dead, I'll be in a grave. So puns are where we use words that sound the same but have different meanings. And good old Mercutio, even when dying, can come up with a bit of clever wordplay. What a guy. Onomatopoeia, which has to be the hardest word to spell in the whole world, is where words sound like their meaning. So for example, splash, bang, hiss. When you actually say the sound, say the word, it sounds like the actual sound it makes. So a splash, if you throw a stone in the water and it goes splash, that is somewhere somewhat similar to the actual sound it makes. Often used in poetry Edgar Allan Poe in the bells here, how they clang and clash and roar. So onomatopoeia is, you know, one of the often used in poetry because it just creates this very auditory effect. So those are some of the techniques. Now onto irony. So humour is really good to use in a piece of writing in an exam, but it's quite tricky. And there are different elements of humour. There's irony, which is also a figure of speech. There are different types of irony though. So verbal irony is the difference between what you say and what you mean. And I'm sure we've all done this before. So in Pride and Prejudice, there's the opening line, very famous. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now when we read the first chapter, we learn that what she actually means is single young ladies pressurised by anxious mothers are in want of a rich husband. But the pompous beginning, it is a truth universally acknowledged, adds to the humour. Now verbal irony is similar to sarcasm, and you have to be careful, particularly in an exam, to draw the line, because sarcasm deliberately intends to hurt someone's feelings. Verbal irony is slightly different. We're not trying to hurt somebody's feelings. You also have situational irony. To understand that, you need to look at the context. That means that irony will only make sense if you understand the context, which is the situation the people are in. So in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the crew of a ship run out of water. And we have the famous water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Now the context is that they're surrounded by water, the sea, which they can't drink, because obviously if you drink seawater, it makes you sick because of the salt. So this makes the situation, them dying of thirst, quite ironic. So the irony, the situational irony, you've got to know the context for it to make sense. Dramatic irony is what we see in a lot of plays, a lot of Shakespeare in particular, and that's where the audience knows something that the characters on stage don't know. So if we look at Shakespeare's Othello as an example, Othello thinks his wife has been sleeping with another man, but the audience know this is not true. Iago has actually planted false evidence, and it's where you just want to shout out, no, it's not true. Satire is another one. That's where you use humour to attack the injustice in society, or you deliberately ridicule a person's foolishness or weakness using humour. On TV you see things like "Have I got news for you?" And in some cases "Mock the weak," that sort of thing does that. And the real kind of famous satirist was Jonathan Swift. In 1729 he published A Modest Proposal, an essay which recommended that poor Irish people sell their children so that rich people can eat them. And in that way the children won't become a burden on society. Now he doesn't mean it, it's satirical, it's mocking the ideas that heartless attitudes people have towards the poor. So there's an extract where he writes, "I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords, who, as they've already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children." So it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, humorous, attacking the injustice through humour. Parody is imitating the style of a particular writer, artist or genre with deliberate exaggeration for comic effect. You probably wouldn't use it in an exam, but it's worth knowing about it. When the Lord of the Rings was really famous, there was a book that came out called Board of the Rings, which is a humorous parody, the whole story. We could give a sort of bit of parody of the beginning of Pride and Prejudice if we were to write something like, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single student in possession of a good phone must be in want of 4G coverage." Now, those are just a few of the techniques. Obviously, I rushed through them in this video, but if you pick up the ebook, there are tests then on those different devices. And if you're interested in grammar, do follow Mrs. Spag on Twitter. She has some fascinating things about grammar that she tweets on a regular basis. And yeah, she's really, really an expert in this topic, so do follow her.